want to talk about developer experience behind a firewall, because I think this is it's maybe not the sexiest subject, but I think it's super, super important, because I think it has ramifications all over the organization. And I think it's something that we need to become more conscious about, and we need more talks about it. Maybe there's even a separate event that's needed for this kind of things. Because I think there's a bunch of people that are having problems and that can't really find their community to talk about it. But before I really get started, I want to say thank you. Because when I'm here, standing in front of you, it's very easy to think like, oh, there's this guy and he knows everything and you know, he must have lots of whatever. There's a ton of people that are standing next to me and that are making this possible. Part of them, well, there's obviously my family, who's a continuous source of inspiration, sometimes frustration, but you know, small kids. But there's a lot more people, because when I'm doing these talks, it's only possible because I have a team that is enabling me to do it, that are providing the funds for doing it by, you know, doing the work that they're doing. There's a whole community of people. There's the people that organize this event, the sponsors. There's you, yeah, it just goes on and on and on. There's too many people to say thank you to. I'll mention a few by name, but I wanted to bring that up front first. So as I said, we're Pronovix. We're a consultancy that specializes in developer portals. We used to be a Drupal agency. We're still doing Drupal, but now specifically for developer portals. We specialize on portals that have like role-based access control needs, because most tooling that's available in the open source world is focused on like flat access. They're all tools like, you know, generate something and put it out there. And if you have like multiple audiences, it gets kind of tricky. And because of that, we've been encountering like a different group of people, and that's what this talk is about. I talk in these communities. So what I've tried to do is bring together knowledge from a bit all over the place, from both tooling, DevRel, API communities, and the technical writer communities, and to combine all the knowledge that is necessary to do a developer portal, because a lot of this is not really generally known or available, and it's very fragmented. One of the things I do, if you're from London, is the Write to Docs meetup here in London. You're very welcome there. It's a very cool community where you can learn a lot. And this is something that we're working on, it's an open source product for building developer portals. But why I'm doing this talk is because in the past 2-3 years, we've been working on just over 30 portals. And there was this really weird thing that I realized, was that some of the biggest portals we were doing were for internal APIs. And this was weird. Or for me, at least, it was kind of like, this is funny. Because most of the talks that you hear in the communities are all about external-facing portals. It's all about marketing and getting new developers from outside of the organization to start using your APIs. And to kind of explain why this is important, or at least for part of the organizations, I think it's important to take a little step back and to look at why organizations make APIs. This is one of those slides that I stole, or that I borrowed, from Manfred from 3Scale. That's now part of Red Hat. And he did this strategy workshop where he talked about the different reasons why people do APIs. He mentions selling APIs, which is the obvious one that everybody starts thinking about, like making an API product. A lot of organizations start doing APIs because they have a mobile app and they need something to feed its information. And then data transactions is also pretty big. If you have boundaries that you want to cross with partners or inside of your organization. Complementing products was not in his slide, but I added it because I've seen people like where I say, you know, sell APIs, and they're like, no, we don't want to sell this. We want to give it away, but it complements our existing product and it's going to make it better. And because of that, we're going to sell more of our existing products. But I think the fifth one is the one that I really want to talk about, and that's internal agility. Because this is one of the biggest ones I've seen mentioned when people are talking about internal developer portals. Is they want to do the Amazon thing. They want to make their business into a microservice hub that they can like recombine and do all kinds of new innovative things with. And they just want to speed up their organization and to increase their metabolism, their internal metabolism. And this internal agility is really important, especially in large multinationals and organizations that have grown from mergers. Like if you got telecom from this country combined with telecom from this country, they have their own tooling, and it's pretty hard to make it all fit together. And that's when internal agility becomes really important. This slide I got from Chet Kapoor from Apogee, and this I wanted to put this in because it shows I really like the concentric circle model of looking at the ecosystems that you can serve with APIs. Interestingly, like different organizations start from different places, so they're not always starting internally. They'll often just jump straight into customer APIs or partner APIs. But some organizations really build like a foundation first and start with internal APIs and then use that as a platform that they can then build further upon for partners and for customers, and maybe even for building an industry API ecosystem. So, and that brings us kind of like to this secret life of corporate APIs, because as I said, it's kind of weird. Like, why don't we hear more about that? So I was thinking a little bit about why is that happening. I think there's three important reasons. One and two is budget and permission. Companies don't really like putting out their dirty socks and showing like, you know, all the things that are going wrong and how much they need to improve. There's very few companies, especially at scale, that are happy to share that kind of knowledge, especially if they're on a stock exchange. They don't want that kind of information to be put out there. It's kind of negative marketing, right? So it's often hard for them to get permission. The other thing, and sorry, Phil, you're not here. But I was looking for somebody who really kind of shows this image of the very busy, very successful DevRel person who's all over the place promoting their platform by being generous. And I think Phil does a really good job at that. But it's not a critic, because this is awesome, being generous and sharing what you know. But because of the nature of the kind of APIs that developer evangelists are promoting, we have this skewed thing in our ecosystem where most of the talks are about public APIs and about the tooling for building public APIs, are about teams that have massive budgets that can iterate and iterate and iterate to make their APIs better, because they have to, because else they're not going to sell their product. But internally, that's a different story. Now, what are the key problems that we've seen or that I've heard from teams? I found 5 problems. I call them the 5 White Walkers of motivation death for this talk. Because each in their own right are really strong demotivation powers. First one is poor discoverability. This is one of the most common things that I've heard from organizations. They have hundreds of APIs all over the place, and everybody's just doing their own thing, and they don't have a central place where they have all their APIs, and it's just really hard. Often the metadata about them are different, so it just becomes really hard to find what you're looking for. And this creates a lot of friction, because then you have to go and reach out to the leader of a certain division, like, hey, we're trying to integrate with you, but we can't really find a way to do this. Oh yeah, we have an API for this. But maybe that's like 1 or 2 weeks later, and it's a lot of frustration. One of the things that I think you can do for that is to create a central repository of all your APIs with sufficient metadata, for example, functional domain space, data domain space, kind of like separating out like what APIs you have, and make it easier to find things. Second one is domain language. All of these 4 are platforms, but if you're building a software, none of them are the platform you're looking for. Often, especially when you have different business units that have merged in the past, they'll have their own way of talking about things, and that and to make sure that everybody understands the same thing is kind of difficult. I was brought to this by Zdenek, who runs Good API, which is an API design company, and he talked. It was really fascinating. He said that before he starts building APIs, like before he even starts working on the design for the APIs, he's doing now exercises for domain language, like just trying to figure out like what is a domain language, what do different people understand under these words, and kind of trying to harmonize the domain language across the organization, which I thought was really, really fascinating. This kind of triggers some of my previous interest into semantic web and that kind of stuff. So I thought it was kind of cool and really exciting to see that, to make a good API design, you might need to go back a little bit and to look at the words that people are using. Jenny Wenger earlier today also mentions taxonomy as like a really important thing. And I think this is very similar. That's making sure that people understand what you're talking about. And the third one is lack of design standards. And this is kind of an obvious one, right? This is something you still hear quite a lot about in the developer evangelist community and in the API space, is that you need to do proper design and make a good design for your API. It's related to the previous point, but still it's distinct because it's often also about structure. If you have in the same organizations different APIs using different structures, you're going to create confusion and frustration. There was at Nordic APIs, there was a talk by, I don't remember her name, from Microsoft. I should have looked it up. But she mentioned that they had this massive problem with I think 5 solutions for their identity management. So if you wanted to get a user object, there were 5 different ways that you could get that, depending on what part of the organization you needed it for. So depending if you're looking for this product, it was different than for the other product. It's a mess. So they started to harmonize that. For next time I do this talk, I'll look it up. But her team worked on a graph database that to harmonize that. It was really interesting. Arnaud, API handyman, he's been doing talks in the API community about API design standards. He also has a free ebook about this. It's probably somebody you should check out if you want to learn more about API design. He talks about setting up a style guide that then can be used throughout your organization to structure your design. You could also use that to do automated reviews. There's tools for that. He mentioned 2 in his talk, but look it up. He had it recorded, or I helped him record it in Berlin. And he mentioned 2 tools that allow you to automatically check if an API if the API design adheres to your style guide. It's really interesting. Fourth is a lack of documentation. Several organizations that I've talked with actually, and this is almost criminal, but when somebody tries to do an integration of a new API, they basically have a team that is going to train them. They do workshops to train people to use APIs. And if you think about that, one of the most important functions of a developer portal and of APIs overall is to increase velocity and to become a sort of self-service hub where you can just go, get the information you need, start building an integration. Then this is kind of weird, right? Like, why would you want to do that? Why would you limit yourself to workshops to train people how to use an API? I've heard in the technical writer community, there's different ideas about this. Like one really low-cost solution you could do is to have the person who's being taught write the manual about the API, and to use the process, maybe even with new developers that are coming into your organization, to have them build the documentation for the API so that the next time you don't need to do the workshop. I've heard organizations where this is kind of like okay, I'll train you, but you have to write the docs kind of thing. So if you have technical writers, that's even better. But yeah, in behind the firewall, there's not always the budget for that. And the last one, the fifth problem I've heard people mention is authentication, like just fragmented authentication, different business units having their own authentication platforms that are not necessarily connected. So if you want to use an API from another business unit, you have to first get their approval or get an account. It's kind of messy. So you probably want to federate that or centralize authentication. And then you can avoid the white walkers of motivation death, and make sure you don't ruin your developers' lives. Now, can DevRel fix this? And I think could you do DevRel behind the firewall? I think probably you could. If you look at Phil's DevRelometer, most of these things you can do behind a firewall and just do for an internal audience, provided you have a big enough organization. But there's actually some organizations that are doing this kind of stuff. Alison Gibbons at API Days in Berlin mentions how at RBC they're doing some of these things. It's not purely internally facing, but to some extent they're also doing it for their internal audience, to make people more enthusiastic about the API program, to help with recruitment and so on and so on. But they do it with spillover effects towards the wider community, which was, I thought, really cool. But yeah, as I said earlier, it's hard to get budget for these efforts. Nobody has a money tree. It's tricky, and it's hard to prove the ROI of developer evangelism. It's even harder to prove the ROI of internal developer evangelism. So probably that's not going to be that easy. So I think, and this is me thinking about it and going into discussions with customers, because we haven't actually done this yet. We have a few projects that are on our way, but I think that the key is going to be in building better processes and some tooling. And I don't want to put full focus on tooling, because I don't think any problem is ever solved purely by tooling. I think it's always a combination of improving your processes and tuning them to the tooling that you're building. But I think that to do developer experience really well inside a firewall, I think it's going to be a lot about efficiency and making processes that are going to give you a good developer experience, kind of like a default out of the box, as part of the process. I think that to do that, I think the core focus should be on developer experience, like on reducing the API friction throughout the process. And here I've got, so to streamline the API journey. And this is a journey you probably already know. Is what everybody is talking about. Probably you have maybe different steps here or there. But the downstream journey, the downstream developer journey, where you get an API and you integrate it with it to build an API integration, that's kind of like what everybody's kind of familiar with. But I think there's a hidden second journey, and that's the upstream developer journey. And that's the journey of the people that are building the APIs and that need to go from we need to do APIs, to what are the resources we should have APIs for, all the way through the design process, implementation, through feedback and support. And I think that's to make a great developer experience if you can improve the upstream journey. So if you can build a good style guide, you can automate the checking, if you can make good documentation about how you're supposed to do APIs in a certain organization, if you can help with standardizing this and providing a good governance model, then I think that you'll be able to improve the downstream experience. Because maybe, for example, you could say your API is only going to get 5 stars if you also have documentation. And you can kind of gamify the process and make it nicer for people to do what they're supposed to be doing. Is this really new? Probably not. Standard operating procedures, business process modeling, these are things that organizations are already doing for a long time. But I haven't seen people really talking about that in terms of API design and building of APIs. And it feels a little bit like the Wild West with the API space, because it's like new and everything is different, but actually it's not to some extent. And I think, but I found this picture, and unfortunately it's in French. I only found it in French. But I thought it really captured the idea really well. Of what is different today in comparison with previously. There's this combination of lean business process modeling, new technologies, this notion that you really have to motivate people and not just tell them what they're supposed to do. And I think this is creating a new environment where we might need to revisit how we're doing things. Kind of this agile, decentralized world. You can't just tell people what they're supposed to do. You have to entice them. You need to make it interesting. You need to make the right thing also the most fun thing to do, I believe. I think gamification can be really useful for that. If you can give meaning to what people are doing in their work, it's going to be much easier to get them to do the things they're supposed to do, or that you would like them to do. If you make it the most fulfilling thing to make documentation and you give them feedback, and you use some of these gamification elements to maybe even some of the black hats elements, like the status notifications and things like that. When somebody uses your API or builds an integration, you get an email like, hey, look at that, somebody else today started an integration project. These might be things that can help drive the engagement in your organization, especially if you have like a really large one. But this feels a little bit like, is this really developer evangelism still then? I'm not really sure. It feels to me a little bit like starts to become more developer engagement. And it's more about motivation and these softer things that are, like, it's not really marketing anymore. It's kind of internal marketing, but yeah, it feels more like engagements than marketing. And but I think that if you want to do API programs at scale, if you want to have loads and loads and loads of APIs, I think that you need to do some of these things, because else it's just not going to work, or it's just going to be too expensive and you're going to end up with a mess. I heard the story of one bank, and they had like a really large bank with lots of divisions all over the world. And they had the problem of different APIs using different domain language. They were differently built. They had no discoverability. All these problems that I mentioned, they were having. And it's kind of a waste to come to that conclusion after you've been building these APIs. It would be much better if you could start out and have a better process from the get-go. And one last point around that is that I think having a better process will also benefit the other ecosystems, not just the internal ecosystem. Because if, as I said earlier, some organizations start with internal APIs and then use those to build up their API products and their partnerships and so on and so on. And if you have those processes to make a consistent design from the get-go, it's going to help with, with the further steps later on also. Summary. I think we need more talks from behind the firewall. I think, so if you have any friends that are stuck in a large corp, that might still get permission to talk about what they're doing and how they're doing their developer portals. Ask them to speak, get them to come to this event or to API the docs or the events that we run or something else. Just get more word out because I think there's, it's easier to carry a burden when it's shared and it's easier if we can learn from each other and help each other. I think, there's these 5 points that can really kill the experience inside the firewall. And they're somewhat related to the external experience, but they're still kind of different because it's slightly different that we talked about. I think that I want to reiterate that it's important to remove friction also from the upstream developer journey, so not only from the downstream developer journey. And I think that if we can build better tooling and processes, then we're going to get better developer experience as a default from the get-go before you need to start retooling and reiterating. Because iterating is very expensive. Iteration is a very good way of doing things, but it's not always feasible no matter where. And if we do all those things, I think we're going to have a lot less hodor days. And that's going to definitely make our colleagues much happier. That's it. Thank you very much.